We have some conversations with school leaders across the state who are encountering the same problems of practice that you are. And so if you haven't seen those videos, you should definitely check them out. We're posting more as the weeks go on, and they really are a labor of love. So it's great to speak with practitioners and educators across the state. We continue to also put out guidance, and guidance comes out as we are able to release it. A lot of work goes into it. Anna mentioned the special education guidance that recently came out, and hopefully all of you find that informative. I know it doesn't answer everyone's questions, but it's important that the State Education Department is putting out the expectation that all students, whether you have an IEP, are an English language learner, are economically disadvantaged, continue to have access to high quality education. And so we encourage you to continue to work with your districts of location for students with disabilities, and that if you are providing services to general education students, which we think all charter schools are, that you push your committee on special education to also provide services to your special education students. We also recently sent out a memo regarding the 180-day requirement, and we know we've received a lot of questions about that. The requirement really is for instructional days when you return, and we don't know when we'll return. We hope that it's before the end of this academic year, but just for the sake of brevity, I'll just briefly go over what was in that 180-day memo, because we have had a lot of questions, and then I'll stop talking and hand it over to Susie. But there are 3 periods of time that your schools should be concerned with. The first is before March 18th. And there is a question whether it's March 16th or March 18th, but for our purposes, we'll say before March 18th. It's covered by Executive Order 202.2. And if you closed before March 18th, there are 3 requirements to count those days towards the 180-day requirement. Requirement 1 is that you were scheduled to be open on that day already. Requirement 2 is that if you were closed, that you were closed by a local or state Department of Health due to an emergency declaration. And the third requirement is that you must have exhausted all available time that you've had, including vacation and snow days. The second period of time is between March 18th and today, March 31st. The requirement is that any day that you were scheduled to be open can count towards the 180-day requirement. So as long as your school was scheduled to be in session, and I'm not talking about remote instruction does not count for instructional time, for the instructional time requirements, I should say, it counts towards the 180-day requirement. The third period of time is under Executive Order 202.11, which was recently issued. And there are 2 requirements to count days during that period towards the 180-day requirement. The first is that you were scheduled to open, but you were closed. Being closed can mean that you're providing remote instruction, but that you were originally scheduled to be in your building on one of those days. And the second requirement is that you must have exhausted all available time, including vacation and snow days. Again, this only pertains to the 180-day requirement if we get back to our brick and mortar buildings before the end of the academic year. As I said, remote instruction is a separate matter. Remote instruction does not count towards the 180-day requirement. However, it does count towards providing your students with the skills necessary to thrive and learn. So it is not time that is not counted. Rather, it's counted in that your mission is to educate students, and you're doing that work. We've gotten a lot of questions about whether you can have a previously scheduled spring break. And the answer for charter schools is yes. If you were scheduled to have a break between April 1st and April 14th, or some portion thereof, you can still cease remote instruction on those days if you so choose. However, I would keep in mind, one, that Governor Cuomo has said that during that time, we might reach the peak of COVID-19 infections in the state, and students might be scared and need structure in their day. And the structure and supports that your schools provide might fill a critical social emotional need for those students. The second thing to consider are optics, and the optics, sorry, my dog's barking in the background, but the optics of being closed when the districts are required to be open. And so I would encourage you to be thoughtful of that. And if you do have any questions, feel free to reach out to us at the charter school office. But thank you.
David, thanks for that. This is Yomika. I'm back. Susie, do you have highlights you want to share with us or updates?
Wanted to thank all of the schools. We've had continued support from them in getting their education continuity plans in. One of the things that David talked about, which we've had a lot of questions about, is this notion of counted time and how does time count? And what we are working on at the Institute is the wisest way to understand the kinds of contacts that you are having with students every day, and what the nature of those contacts are, and the kind of time frame for them. And it varies obviously across grade levels, with more, what we're finding is kind of more planned contacts for students at upper grade levels, you know, kindergarten, first grade students, less kind of full course video meetings with teachers that extend for sustained periods of time. And so we're going to be working with you to kind of capture in what we hope is a least invasive, in terms of questions that we need to ask you, time frame, structure to understand how many touch points you're having with students, if that was in your education accountability plan, how you are tracking those things. We said this from the very beginning, right? If we do a really smart job of keeping track of our time and contacts with our students and our families, then we'll be in a much better position whenever we get back to school to talk about the actual instructional time that occurred. So stay tuned for that. Happy to speak with individuals about it. Feel free to call me. Most of you have got my phone number. If not, shoot me an email. We can set up a time to talk. That's it. That's all I have.
All right, thank you. So one question we have that we received in advance was about the June regions. And so the question is, the June region states, are they still planned? Susie, you want to start?
Well, as much as I would love to tell the regents what to do, even with your permission, Yumika, I don't think they actually would let us do that. I don't know, David, if you've got answers about regents and the provision of regents, great. I will just say to all of the SUNY authorized schools that if regents are available and accessible and you have students ready to succeed on them, that's great. If you have some other concerns about how you're going to, certainly for graduating seniors, how you're going to navigate graduation, that's a planned conversation we're going to have down the road if we don't return to kind of bricks and mortar schooling.
Thank you. Now, David, what do the regents say?
Well, like Susie, I do wish I could tell the regents. No, the decision hasn't been made yet. It's something that they are taking very seriously. In an ideal world, we would love to be back in session and provide and administer the regents exam. We're taking our lead from Governor Cuomo and taking this at a two-week period at a time. A decision will be forthcoming, but my advice to schools is prepare your students for the regents exam, prepare them for the content that you would normally teach. And we think that even if they do not take the regents exam, it'll serve them well in whatever pursuits they are engaged in.
Great, thank you. Thank you both. Another question that we received, will your teams be asking for attendance during remote learning? Susie, you kind of touched on this a little bit when you gave the highlights about documentation, but I'm wondering if there's anything either you want to add or say or answer to that question.
David, is that Bryson yelling in the background?
That was not Bryson this time.
That was my name, dog.
Oh, sorry, Albany Dog Club. So I don't, We do not anticipate setting some minimum number of minutes. That is not the intention of trying to find out the information. What I'm really trying to do is gather what's actually happening, which includes, for some of our schools, a phone call a couple of times a day to the younger kiddos, with provision of, packets of materials and other things that I know were given out and then sent out. And gradually some of those experiences are expanding, so kids may have more direct contact. But simply, I think it's wise for all of us to think about, if I'm a teacher, if I'm a first grade teacher, calling, my fabulous student Ralph twice a day to check in and talk about the story that we were reading, that we ought to be keeping track of that in some way that is not cumbersome, but trying to keep track of that, so that when we get to the end of this, and we're going to get to the end of this, we have an awful lot of data about the hard work that your teachers are putting in to keep in contact with their students and keep them engaged.
Okay, great, thank you. David, do you want to answer?
I think Susie covered it.
Okay, we'll take a quick few questions now from the chat before we turn it over to Paul to answer some questions about special education.
All right, so David, you very successfully dodged us calling you out on being the single person who canceled spring break. So thank you for your very elegant explanation. But we're still seeing a lot of questions from folks in the chat. I'm sure you're seeing it as well. So could you actually talk a little bit, let's go up to the 50,000 foot level, talk a little bit about the link between the 180-day requirement and funding, right? And this other question of what about charter schools who actually started in mid-August? And so they were actually ticking off days well before their sort of local district was even in session.
Yeah, good, very good question. And I just wrote it in the chat, so you have it in writing, and I'll say it again. The 180-day waiver ensures, rather, that you'll receive funding if the conditions of that waiver are met, and so that you'll be held harmless. And we've been working with districts across the state, no one more closely than with Angeli Matos and the New York City DOE around that to ensure that funding continues to flow. We're also proposing some emergency regulations at the April Board of Regents meeting to enshrine that in the regulation, just so that there's another place to point to. The 180-day waiver only comes into effect if we go back to our brick and mortar instruction at some point. So hopefully things get better, we're back, and then schools are required to meet the 180 days. And I outlined before some of the ways that they can do that. If we have schools that have 190, 192 days, which many of our charter schools do, then that is a matter, the reduction of those days is a matter that they would bring up with their authorizer, but they would be fine for a per pupil billing standpoint. In fact, those schools would probably be sitting pretty well to cushion some of the lost days, because they would have, in the case I gave, if they have 190 days, they would have a 10-day buffer. If schools have 180 days and they need to make up days, and we're back in session, then let's say they have a traditional calendar, they'll have to start eating into vacation and snow days if they want to have funding remain intact. If schools can't make up the 180 days, that's something that we'll have to address on a school-by-school basis. But the governor has been pretty clear that if we go back, schools will have to sacrifice some vacation time in order to make up for lost instructional days.
Thanks, David. So one last question from the chat, and then we'll turn it over to Paul. And Paul, really looking forward to some special education specific conversation, because I know that's constantly a source of question and concern for folks, and clearly even today in the questions we're seeing in the chat. So David and Susie, talk a little bit about what either you're thinking, you're seeing, your predictions, or your best guidance around high school graduation pathways, especially in light of any open questions related to the June regents.
I think that it's still too early to tell. Ultimately, you know, whether or not the state and the regents will automatically pass every student who was scheduled to take a regents exam, should they be canceled, which they haven't been yet, that'll be something that the regents will take up. In terms of promotions or credit accumulation, that's also something that the regents, credit accumulation will be something the regents address. Promotional criteria will probably be something that is decided locally by the charter school as the LEA for those students.
Thanks. Susie, any thoughts?
So this is one of the questions that we're going to be reaching out with is generally what assessments are you using? Just, you know, what's possible, what's not possible. I know a number of our schools have an interim assessment program that may or may not be able to be administered with everybody remotely. There's a lot of unknowns about that. So again, we want to understand, we're not trying to impose, but we want to understand what the plans are for assessments. I've spoken with a couple of schools that serve high school students that have talked about, in the event that there are not regents exams available, you know, could they construct a set of regents, you know, prior regents questions, utilize those. Would we be open to that? We would be, if that was what the school thought was the right step to take in terms of ensuring that the students had the skills and knowledge they were designed to have to pass the course and graduate. So we're trying to design flexibility and understanding. It's been great, by the way, to talk to a couple of leaders who are like, these high school kids may be home, but they've been mine for a lot of years and they know what they're doing, and we still want them to have that accomplishment. And so we're trying to navigate it with all of you, and not at this point kind of say you have to have X number of minutes on Zoom to graduate.
All right, so at the risk of Paul keeping you on ice for one more second, David, I'm going to put you back on the spot because I think the chat folks are asking. All right, you just answered. So the guy, let me just check my understanding, David, of your comment and see if I can summarize my understanding if that answers some of the questions folks are raising. The guidance to continue to give instruction during what otherwise would have been spring break is SED's guidance or mandate in the current context in order to ensure that students are as best supported as they possibly can be in an unprecedented situation. It is not specific to counting those days towards the 180. Is that accurate?
Well, I would say first and foremost, this is not something that's from SED. This is not something that we're just making up. This is in Executive Order 202.11. So we're guided by 3 executive orders: 202.1, 202.4, and 202.11. Charter schools are not required to provide remote instruction during their previously scheduled spring break. District schools are, and the New York City DOE is a district, and so they would be included in that. Again, that's not something that the DOE has a choice that regarding. That's not something that the DOE needs to send guidance on regarding. It's in black and white in Executive Order 202.11, and I gave the link over there. Charter schools are required, at least my understanding is this is for New York City and SUNY as well, but we are requiring all charter schools to provide for remote instruction and to implement a instructional continuity plan. Remote instruction does not count towards the 180 days. However, the instruction that you're providing does count towards your students continuing to close the achievement gap and working towards or maintaining proficiency in the core content areas. It's not wasted time. We hypothesize, because many of our districts had a late start compared to charter schools, we hypothesize that that many of our charter schools, when testing resumes next year, will be ahead of the game in terms of districts. Students still need to learn. Students still need to work towards college and career readiness. And that's what you're doing day in and day out. To conflate that with some funding requirement or to say, is it required or not, is beside the point. It's the right thing to do. And again, I see some other questions. The DOE cannot have spring break between April 1st and April 14th. It's in the executive order. All district schools are required to provide remote instruction. That does not apply to charter schools, but I would strongly recommend that you think about the optics and about the social emotional needs that instruction provides during these very stressful times to your students. I spoke to one school leader today who is providing their teachers with a little bit of a break, and they're doing pre-recorded lessons for students, and they're going to have those over a few days so students can continue to do work. And that's something I would continue to have you think outside the box regarding. And the very last thing I'll say, and I'm happy to talk about this more though, the 180-day waiver only applies when you're back in session. There's nothing other than implementing your educational continuity plan now that you need to worry about. It's only when you're back does this 180-day requirement fall into place. And pursuant to the executive order, some of the days that you're providing now will count towards that 180 days. For example, pursuant to executive order 202.4, any day that you were scheduled to be open between March 18th and today will count towards the 180 days. And so you are accruing credit, so to speak. And we're working very closely with districts to ensure that your funding continues unabated.
Okay, thank you very much for that, David. We're going to turn to Paul now. Paul, thank you again for joining us. As I'm sure you already know, there have been a lot of questions about special education during the remote learning and school closures. Could you just start by sharing a summary of the recent guidance that was released on this topic?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Yeah. I'm Paul O'Neill. For some of you, I am your lawyer, but that is not the hat I am wearing today, and this is not legal advice. I'm also the co-founder and help run something called the National Center for Special Education in Charter Schools, and we are a nonprofit that tries to do everything we can to support charter schools nationwide for kids with disabilities. And so in that work, we've been very active since this whole mess started, trying to get information out to folks. There's lots of things on our website, National Center for Special Education Charter Schools, ncescs.org, if you're looking for resources. So we've weighed in on lots of different ways. I just finished doing a Q&A for authorizers, and we have another one for schools that are probably going to go live on our website tomorrow, I would guess. And those collect up the sorts of questions that are coming here on this webinar that we've been receiving since we've been doing webinars for the last couple of weeks. So if you're looking for an authority that will drill down on some of the things that are going to get deeper than we can get today, I recommend those. But I want to talk to you about two things. One, the state guidance that recently came out, and two, some things that are going on in Washington that I think you should know about. David's group, the NYSEG, put out on the 27th a guidance document about kids with disabilities in charter schools in New York State. It covers a lot of ground. It doesn't cover everything. Someone said to me the other day, well, it doesn't answer all the questions. It doesn't answer all the questions, but you know, special education is difficult in normal times, and trying to apply it in these circumstances is maddening. And take this as whatever comfort it can be. I'm dealing with places all over the country. There is nowhere that is drilled down as much as New York is right now on issues of support from authorizers and organizations like the New York City Center the New York Association. You guys are in the middle of it. A lot of places have barely started to deal with these issues yet. So the level of detail that we're going to get here is going to be deeper than in some other places. Nashville, Denver, they're just getting going. And you guys are in the thick of it. Okay, so guidance came out on the 27th, where the state tried to address various issues that relate to serving kids with disabilities in charter schools here. Starts out with a list of useful resources for online resources that could be useful to you if you're trying to do good things through virtual means for kids with disabilities, and you might want to check that out. An important thing that the guidance makes clear is that if you are switching everybody over to online means, then it's not a change in placement. It's not you do not have to have an IEP meeting per se in order to make adjustments to the kids' IEPs, because what we've basically done is shifted everybody over, and in doing that, we're not requiring that. Not every state is interpreting it that way. The guidance from New York references a webinar that happened 2 weeks ago where a bunch of federal authorities got together and sort of presented like we're presenting here. And based on that, a lot of states are saying, well, it sounds like it's okay to go that way. And so flexibility is the name of the game. Everybody's trying to be as flexible as possible, working with parents, working with what's possible for each individual child. And obviously, kids with disabilities present in a wide range of ways. One size does not fit all. And so the bottom line is flexibility, and trying to work with the families and trying to make the changes and adjustments that you need to make. One of those adjustments is often trying to make related services like occupational therapy, physical therapy, other kinds of services available as much as possible through remote means. And there was guidance that came out of the federal government a little while ago that said that they were relaxing standards against teletherapy that was provided on platforms that have not been approved for HIPAA and might get in the way of student confidentiality rules, but those have been both softened at the federal level and explicitly through the state guidance. Also mentioned in the state guidance here is that English language learners should continue to be served, especially those kids with disabilities as well. Their IEP should be followed with the same level of flexibility we're talking about for everything else. Timelines, another thing that is addressed in the state guidance. Another area where we're looking for flexibility and for working with parents to try and make adjustments that everybody can live with regard to things like evaluations and reevaluations and annual reviews and due process hearings. And all of it comes down to work with the parents if you can work with the parents. Now, doesn't spend a lot of time talking about what happens if you can't work with the parents. And that is a challenge, especially in an environment where the ordinary mechanisms for settling disputes with parents over IEPs is not easy to access, right? It's not easy to go to a due process hearing in the circumstance that we're in now. One thing that's clear from the guidance and that's clear from federal guidance is that there are services that you hopefully can provide, most of them hopefully, remotely, but there will be services and there will be convenings, evaluations that can't really take place until everybody's back in an ordinary circumstance where they're back in the school and we can be face to face. And so for the things that you can provide, you should provide. And the things that you can't provide now need to be deferred and treated as compensatory services when the school reopens. I want to mention what I said before about some federal things going on. About a week and a half ago, we were having conversations with lots of folks in Washington about the fact that the Senate seemed to be pushing to tie to the stimulus package that just went through, the $2 trillion stimulus package, a provision that would have allowed states to basically waive the IDEA for a year. And that has transformed a little bit. It got a lot of pushback. It's transformed, but what stayed in the stimulus bill that was signed on Friday was a provision that the U.S. Secretary of Education is supposed to provide Congress in 30 days, which is roughly the 26th of April, but that's a Sunday, so, you know, sorta, with a list of things that she would like to waive or like flexibility around, I think that's the term they're using, with regard to the ESEA, the IDEA, Section 504, and some of the higher ed rules. And so the expectation is that she may come back to Congress and say, there are various aspects of what everybody is on this call is currently trying to do that you're not going to be held accountable to do going forward, either through this crisis or after this crisis. And that's something that everybody should pay some attention to, because I don't think we know exactly what that's going to look like. You can imagine that in Washington right now, a lot of people are trying to get their thoughts heard on what this ought to look like, what should be waived and what shouldn't be waived. One thing that was talked about a little bit earlier when the Senate was pushing for, the Senate Republicans were pushing to limit IDEA, is it may be possible that the provision of services once the schools reopen, the compensatory services, that obligation might be expensive for districts and for schools who are responsible for providing. And some folks have been pushing for some flexibility on whether or not that will quite kick in. So I imagine there are probably some questions here, so I'll shut up.
All right.
Thank you very much for that.
All right, so we'll do a couple of special ed related questions. And I think, you know, Paul, one that I'm not necessarily seeing coming through the chat, but that has been asked a lot, and in particular for folks not necessarily in a DOE setting. So a lot of districts aside from the New York City DOE are actually had been messaging prior to this guidance that they were fully closed to all student instruction. And so therefore, we're not even endeavoring to provide any services to any student, and including special education students. What guidance would you have either for schools in that situation, or even New York City DOE schools, in terms of tracking and communicating? What are some actions that schools can be taking right now so that when we are on the other side of this, they are as well positioned as possible to be advocating for the services to which their students are entitled?
Right. Well, first, let me say, you're right about this issue about whether you're providing services or not. What the guidance says, the federal guidance, not David's guidance, but the federal guidance says that if you're not providing what they call educational services at all to anybody, then you don't have to worry about providing special education services to kids with IEPs. But if you're endeavoring to provide educational services, then you bring that with you. You bring those obligations. Every kid needs to be served. Some of those services may get deferred, but you have that obligation. There are districts that are taking the position that they're not serving anybody, but then they start to provide some supplemental support. And I think that's very tricky. And I think that any district that does that is going to have to be careful about that looking, fraud's an ugly word, but you know, if you're trying to avoid accountability for certain things while still providing some stuff, I think you have to be careful. And I think that, to get to the latter part of your question, I think tracking what you're doing is absolutely crucial. I mean, it's crucial ordinarily, but what we have here is a situation where nobody quite knows what the right thing to do is, and it may be that you come up with ways to serve kids that somebody might in retrospect say wasn't the best way to do it. But I think what I'm expecting is a lot of flexibility for people who tried to get it right, who provided services thinking that this was the right way to go, and ultimately maybe found out that wasn't the best. But unless you've tracked it, unless you have really explicitly captured what you're doing and trying to do, when we look back at this, you know, from the future and look and see what you did, it's the schools that have nothing to describe, it's the schools that haven't kept the details that are going to be in trouble.
Thanks, Paul. And I think that's a real theme that we've heard over these weeks from David and Susie as well. I know that there are many, many more special education questions. I feel like we've only scratched the surface, in particular at this sort of, in this world with this new SED guidance. But we are going to move on. Yomika has a short update on the budget, and then we're going to turn it over to Corey to facilitate some New York City specific topics. So Yomika?
Thanks, Anna. So Budget update I have is brief. I saw a lot of the questions in the chat. A lot of questions, what's the per pupil funding? What do we know? And the shorter answer is we don't know what the per pupil funding is. We don't know what the overall education aid is. That information is not out yet. I'll say the budget bills are not printed that include the education aid. The budget bills have started to be printed, as many of you probably know. There are two budget bills out. One of them is a revenue bill. One of them is a bill that covers public protection and general government. Again, they do not include the education aid information, so we don't have that. Since the budget bills have already started to come out, I'm assuming that by the end of the week we will have the rest of the budget bills out there, and we will update you when we have that information. The budget is due, technically, the budget is due tomorrow, April 1st. The governor today, as you all may have seen in his briefing, indicated they were still working on the budget. They're still negotiating that. I will say that it's fair to say at this point, we all know that the COVID-19 crisis has hit state revenues, hit everyone, businesses, et cetera, all of us hard. The governor has said in many of his press conferences that the state was expecting federal COVID-19 aid to help support New York's losses, help cover some of the revenue needs for the state. The governor's indicated that what was received was not enough, and that would impact education and other local aid. Again, I don't have any details. The details, as I know it, have not emerged in terms of what exactly that would mean. At this point, again, we're just waiting for the information. And I would say that for right now, the governor has a suggestion that he's floated that would involve the division of the budget to look at revenues the state has every quarter. So the idea, according to the governor, if I'm interpreting this properly, is that the budget would be put out. The budget would include a number for state education aid. Every quarter, the division of the budget then would be charged to make sure that the revenues that the state expected at that point, based on their budget, are actually received. If they are not received, if the revenue is not available, the full amount of revenue is not available to make those payments to the division of budget would then be charged to adjust those payments. Now, I want to be clear that that's what the governor has suggested. That I have not seen, obviously, a printed budget bill that the legislature is going to vote on. That's still something that's going to be subject to negotiation. But that's the kind of information that we have. Unfortunately, I don't have anything more concrete. And like I said, once we do have it, we will share with everyone. There is another related issue I just want to talk about, which is a financial issue. The U.S. Small Business Administration is offering disaster assistance loan programs. We have got a couple of questions about this over the last week or so. Folks should look to our COVID resources page on our website, but also for more information, ESD, the New York State Empire State Development Corporation, has information on its website about the Paycheck Protection Program, the low interest loan, and the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program. Both of those programs offer funding to nonprofits. It may be something at least that it's worth taking a look at to see if you would qualify for any of those fundings if you're interested to apply. And like I said, ESD has great FAQs on their website about that. And we will post all this later so everyone can see those and get access to that website. Just another quick question. I just saw this is not budget related necessarily. It's a question about construction. If folks have construction projects that they're looking for, we have had schools receive an exemption from Empire State Development regarding construction of their schools, indicating that they were, in fact, an essential business. We recommend that if you have that situation that you apply to ESD to make sure that you get that response back from ESD, that your school construction can continue. If you'd like to give us a call or email us in advance of doing that, we're happy to answer whatever questions we can answer. And again, we'll post that link to ESD's website on that as well. That's my update. Thank you.
And Yumika, if I could just add one more thing. So the U.S. Government passed the CARES Act, which is the large COVID-19 stimulus fund. And in there is a provision for Title I emergency relief. And so we expect that all LEAs that are Title I eligible across the state, including charter schools, will get some money from this. And right now we're estimating that the average award will be somewhere between $150,000 and $180,000. Although, of course, if you're a smaller school, you'll get a little bit less. If you're a larger school, you'll get a little bit more. We're also looking at some flexibilities under the charter school program grant for providing some relief to charter schools. And we'll continue to try to work to get funding where we can from the federal government to help charter schools across the state.
That's terrific. Thank you, David, for that. All right, so now we will turn it over to Corey from the Charter Center. Corey?
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Yumika. So I just want to quickly get started. We have Anjali and Erin from the DOE on the phone. Just because I know they've been responding in the chat, I just wanted to give them a chance. I think Erin is here today wearing the authorizer hat. So Erin, anything you want to say to schools about the spring break for DOE and DOE authorized schools?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So we just want to reiterate that charters can take their previously scheduled spring breaks. We are going to be sharing additional guidance in the coming days. I know I was seeing a lot of concern in the chat about what that looks like for break and beyond April 14th. So we'll be sharing guidance about that. And as Anjali mentioning in the chat, more will be coming out about the DOE spring break.
Great. So let's go back to the grab and go food. I don't know if this is Erin or Anjali, but any updates on how that program has been working in New York City?
Hi, Corey. So right now we are seeing a higher demand for grab and go meals. The plan at the moment is to extend the hours and eventually allow adults to pick up meals. I will keep you posted when this becomes official. Another item just to note, we're not sure whether grab and go meals will be available during spring break. So more to come on that.
Okay. How about the rec centers that are operating in the city for children of first responders?
The same with that, still TBD on whether they're going to be open during spring break. We should have decisions in the next couple of days.
Anything you can tell us about, I've seen a bunch of special education questions come up in the chat. Any updates that you can give besides the guidance? I know you released, I think it was probably a week ago now, a little more.
Mm-hmm. No new information at the moment. We are preparing for our webinar that's happening Thursday at 3. I sent the link in the chat, and it was also included in the memo that we sent on Sunday. So please register there, and you'll learn the latest then.
Also, one of the questions that I just saw in the chat is, I just want to make sure that we heard you right, but there may be a possibility that parents can pick up grab and goes at some point.
Yeah, that's correct, Corey. So there's right now, any adult can pick up on behalf of students, but the new thing is that adult meals will be available for adults, and so anyone could go to any of our locations and pick up meals for their children or for themselves. That is going to become formal in the next couple of days, so I will share that guidance. Additionally, the buildings are going to be open for longer. I don't have the exact time yet.
Great. While we're talking about building, can you talk about what the building access is right now for DOE schools? So this would impact charters that are co-located.
Yeah, so at the moment, any admin personnel, so principal, DOO, et cetera, can access DOE buildings to pick up mail, reset servers, et cetera. That's ongoing for this week and next week. And just to clarify, you're not allowed to sit in the building and work. That is not allowed at the moment. But we do understand that people may need access to items that are located in the building. We will keep you posted on a week-by-week basis as this may change for the future.
Another issue that we've heard from schools is what, if anything, is DOE planning around summer school?
Right, so at the moment, we don't have any final decisions on summer school. We're hoping to have some update in the next month or so regarding, you know, the next question that we're getting related to summer school and whether our buildings are going to be open then. That is also TBD. And related to that, Corey, the other thing I want to share is that summer construction projects are also in discussion right now on whether those can go on. So we're hoping to have updates on those items in the next couple of weeks.
And just so we're clear, these are summer construction projects in co-located schools.
Correct. So summer construction projects in co-located schools managed by SEA or DOE, and projects that perhaps were previously approved for charters to do construction as well.
Also, just want to give an update. I know we all know that it has closed for payment cycle 6. Can you tell charters in New York City how DOE is processing the last payment for the year for schools?
Sure. So we have all invoices in. So thank you everyone for the hard work. At the moment, you should, between yesterday and today, we're sending out any comments if we have questions about your invoices. And as we said previously, schools were advised to complete their invoice with using the existing guidance. If there are any changes, you know, that we hear from SED and others around the impact to per pupil given the COVID closure, we are expecting that schools will make those adjustments as needed in the reconciliation cycle in July. And so no changes at the moment. If there is some decision made by the governor and SED around an impact to per pupil, or if schools are held harmless, which is what we're hoping that happens.
As are we.
Thank you, David. Then, you know, we'll communicate that and share more guidance in preparation for the per pupil invoice that opens, the per pupil reconciliation that opens in July.
So charter schools in New York City can anticipate on-time payments on May 1st for their per pupil.
That's correct, Corey. So we are committed to paying you, right? We know that you, of course, need your funding to run viable schools. I will say, Corey, that as you know, we have a very thorough review process of the invoices that are submitted. We understand that folks are super busy right now and dealing with this crisis. We just ask that schools give us back their emails with their comments on rejections as soon as they can. Right now, our timeline is 2 business days so that we can process and review those resubmissions as soon as we can as well, and ensure that we can meet that May 1st deadline. And so to recap, we're committed to paying you on time. Please reply to our emails with our comments when you get them. If you have questions, we are ready to support you. But of course, we can only promise on-time payment after we have all the information necessary for the invoice.
And then the last funding question I'll ask you is on the NISATEL funding, which I know we've seen you send out several emails, but any additional information for charters in New York City on that?
So we sent the final deadline in our last memo. And so here, sorry, give me 1 second. Where are my deadlines? Okay, so the deadline for NISTL is April 24th. We are encouraging schools to spend by April 15th or as soon as possible. Our systems get really glitchy when everybody's trying to spend at the same time. So we urge you to spend ASAP. So that you can avoid any errors or issues. we are also, as you know, working simultaneously on your per pupil. So our support is very limited during this time. So yes, spend as soon as possible. There is some guidance coming up around following up with vendors. Look out for an email that's coming from us in the next day or two.
And just because we've been having another funding question, I know Stacy, I saw this question and David just answered you, but for everyone, the supplemental funding, which was approved in last year's budget, which was for 24.9 million, divided by the number of students who are currently enrolled as of February of this year in New York City charter schools, that money can only be distributed after April 1st. Historically, the money usually comes like late June, early July. Is that right, David?
That's correct. Yeah, I need time to order the large novelty checks.
But as David just said, that supplement, it was passed last year. It's part of last year's budget. It has nothing to do with this year's budget. David has just put in the chat so everyone can see they expect that supplemental funding to be paid as usual. So good news on that front. I think that's all from New York City DOE, unless Anjali or Erin, there was anything else you wanted to say to close out.
Nothing else.
Nope, nothing else.
I think I should just quickly clarify with David. Sorry, Yomika. David, when you say the supplemental funding to be paid in June as usual, and you need to order the novelty checks, was I missing out on the novelty checks for all of these years?
I'm like Ed McMahon, you know, with the, what is it, this
Publishers Clearinghouse.
Clearinghouse, that's right.
David will come 6 feet from your door and knock on it with a large check. Sorry, Yomika, go ahead.
No problem. That's great. All right. Well, this concludes our call for today, our webinar. Look for the information to be posted on our website, as they always are. Please join our forum discussion, and please join all the calls that are going to come up with all the good information from DOE and others. Thank you all, and be safe.
Thanks, everyone.